I'm going to start by giving you an introduction to how to talk about VR, right? So we're going to talk about point of view in virtual reality, how we experience, discuss, and create the virtual world, and that should be sort of a window into discussion for us. So my understanding is that we've got a diverse group here. So some of you are doing business, some of you are computer scientists, and some of you are journalists. So it should be an interesting mix. Just so I get a sense of who we have in the room, how many of you have done or seen virtual reality? All right, so you guys are experts. And how many of you are looking to, at some point, create something in virtual reality? Okay, and how many of you think you might, at some point, write about something in virtual reality? Okay, great. So regardless of what your relationship is to VR, at some point you're probably going to want to tell somebody about it, right? Whether it's a project you're creating or an experience that you've seen. So what we're going to talk about today will help you use and explain the tools available to you in XR storytelling. That's kind of how I got thinking about this. I was trying to explain to students at Emerson College LA, like how to think about both how to think about creating stuff and also how to talk about existing projects. And I run into this problem all the time when I'm, I don't know, in the world at large, whether it's at conferences or I just meet someone and I tell them I created the first immersive sitcom, and immediately it becomes a game of 20 questions, right? They're like, oh, well, what can you do? Can you change the story? Can you walk around the space? And it's like a 20-minute conversation, which is really fun, but you can only have so many of those, right? So what if you could take that 20-minute conversation and simplify it to 5 words? So that's part of what we're gonna do here today. I'm gonna give you a menu of options. So here you can see there's all that black text, right? So I could say all of that, or I could just say mint white chocolate. So my goal is to get you to your VR thing faster, whatever that is for you. So how do we talk about VR? Well, when I was getting my master's degree at USC Film School, professors would talk about the two-shot, the dolly shot, the over-the-shoulder. I thought they were talking about basketball and then I was in the wrong class. But I eventually figured out what the terms meant. And then my classmates and I were able to use those terms to critique existing films and plan our own. It was really helpful to have a common language. So where might we find terms like that for virtual reality? Your 4th grade English teacher had a vocabulary for talking about point of view, right? But not everything from the past applies to the present. Your teacher also had a pencil sharpener that would wreak havoc on an Apple pen. So we are now living in a new world. The simple designations of first, second, and third person that we use to categorize books, movies, and video games don't cover all the options and combinations available in XR. When I realized, I did what probably many of you would do if you found yourselves in the same situation. Out of necessity, when we get stuck, we create the solution, right? So I'm going to today review the existing language we have to talk about point of view, show how it does and doesn't apply to VR, and then to allow us to better communicate clearly about the medium, I'll introduce a taxonomy for virtual reality, which is a marriage of old and new. So this taxonomy includes 4 point of view tiers. We've got narrative, which is like chocolate. It's got flavor, but it's not complicated. We've got visual, no layers, no fillings, just plain vanilla. We've got effectual, it's kind of like red velvet. It's a little weird. You like beets and cake? Okay, I'll try it. And then we've got experiential, which is our blueberry cheesecake. And you're like, cheesecake doesn't go on a wedding cake? And I'm like, well, maybe it could be your something blue. Give it a chance. So we're going to explore. Point of view is most commonly thought of in terms of narrative point of view, right? First, second, or third person. The point of view from which the story is being told. Just to give a quick recap of point of view, which you're probably all a little bit familiar with, first-person narrative point of view is exemplified by Ernst Cline's Ready Player One. Maybe some of you have read the book. Maybe some of you have watched the movie. If you watched the movie, that doesn't count as doing your homework, guys. But it still serves as a good example. So here you can see that Wade is telling his own story in the first person using words like me, my, and I. A quick example of second-person narrative point of view can be found in Choose Your Own Adventure books, right? The author is narrating not his, but your experience. And then third-person narrative is plentiful in books, and I mean, we have examples like J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, for example, right? Third-person point of view can be limited in scope or omniscient, where the author knows only one character's, or the narrator knows only one character's thoughts, everyone's thoughts, or somewhere in between. The key is that the third-person narrator is neither telling his or her own thoughts or experiences, nor someone else's, but another third person's, or in the case of Harry, third wizard's. So that's narrative. Everyone keeping up? Okay. Now, in addition to narrative point of view, in film, there's also visual point of view. Most movies from Casablanca to Wonder Woman are filmed in the third person objective point of view, right? So this means that the moviegoer is not a character in the film. Even if the guy behind you at Endgame is dressed like Captain America and saying all the lines, he's still not in the movie. We only wish he knew that. Then first-person visual point of view is when the player or moviegoer is a character in the story. You might not be familiar with this because it's never used in video games. Just kidding, I'm making sure you're paying attention. First person is used all the time in video games. You've all heard of first-person shooter, right? So it's very common in video games. In film, it's a little more rare. I think there was a movie that Warner Brothers did years and years ago called Lady in the Lake that was filmed in first person. But my favorite example is when a wedding videographer comes up to you at the cocktail hour and says, say something to the happy couple. The videographer is anticipating that the couple will be watching the video, and the intention is for them to feel like they're experiencing their wedding day all over again, right? So that's actually kind of the closest we had to first-person visual plus first-person narrative until we got to VR, right? You can see that. And then that takes us to second person. So if third person, the viewer isn't in the story, and in first person, the viewer is in the story, what's second person, right? It feels like your fourth grade English teacher started teaching math, is what that sounds like. But it's half and half. You're straddling the two worlds. You've got 1 foot in the story and 1 foot outside of it. The easiest way to think of it is that second person is meta. It acknowledges the medium. Sometimes this is done fantastically by the character breaking the fourth wall and talking to the audience. You guys have all seen that? Yeah? And sometimes it's done logically with the conceit of a documentary film crew, as in the case of The Office, or if any of you have played Mario 64. There's an example in there too where Latiku, the cameraman, is you're Latiku and you have his perspective, but you're moving Mario. So in books, second person acknowledges there's a reader, you. In film, it acknowledges there's a viewer, you. So how does all of this work in virtual reality? Does it? Well, in VR, the viewer becomes the camera or the player. So as a result, it's easy to think that point of view in VR is as simple as VR is always first person. Well, in the sense of visual point of view, it is, right? The virtual reality participant is always having a first person visual experience of the 360 virtual reality scene. But that doesn't necessarily tell us the role to the story, right? And it also leaves a lot up in the air. Whose story is the viewer seeing? What's the narrative point of view? So there are a few different ways to convey narrative, and VR experiences with voiceover narrative provide a great opportunity to show the difference between narrative and visual point of view and the importance of being able to distinguish between them. So I'm going to use as an example Notes on Blindness. I'm not sure, have any of you heard of or seen this experience? Okay, we got one. That's pretty good for VR. VR audiences are small these days. So this is an experience where the author, John Hull, audio recorded his experience of going blind. And so they took that audio and they paired it with visuals that they created to try and replicate that experience. So when you're watching it, right, or being in the show, you're hearing the first person narration of John Hull, and at the same time you're seeing the filmmaker's approximation of what John Hull would have been seeing. So the key here is that the visual matches the narrator, right? So you can conclude that you are John Hull. You are having the experience that he was having when he was recording himself. And we're going to call that matching situation, where the visual and the narrative match, embodied first-person narrative. Okay, now we're going to take a look at another experience. This is 52 Places to Go, Iceland. It's a piece done by the New York Times. In this piece, I'll ask the same question. Has anyone happened to have seen this one? No. There's a lot of New York Times pieces. But the idea is it's a travel piece. So you're hearing the first-person narration of Jada, right? Jada Wan, 52 Places Traveler. But at the same time, as you can tell from this picture, you're seeing Jada. So you're not her, right? So think about it. This is also first-person narration, like Notes on Blindness. And it's first-person visual. You're seeing it in a first-person perspective, but they don't match. So it's the same, but it's different. So we're going to call this not matching experience disembodied first-person narrative. So a disembodied experience will get your audience to think or question. It detaches your audience from that moment. So just for those of you who are creators, it's worth noting that an embodied experience will immerse the viewer in the narrative, and a disembodied experience will detach the audience from the moment at hand. And by detaching it, it puts the viewer into a more analytical mindset, right? So if you want someone to live in the experience and really think they're there, embodied would be effective. But if you want to shut down the participant's emotional response and ignite their intellectual response, prompting them to think and question, you might want to lean more heavily on a disembodied first-person experience. It's more Brechtian in nature. So, okay, great. So that kind of covers the basics of narrative and visual. And so for the most part, at least right now, virtual reality experiences tend to be first-person visual, but I want to give you a long and broad perspective. And so while it's a little bit confusing, I'm just going to go off on a quick little tangent and tell you about the other options for visual, because while it's challenging, it is technically possible to have other visual perspectives. So here, for example, you can see some photos from a YouTube video that a company did. And so let's see. How can I describe this clearly? So this is giving you a third-person visual perspective. So but you can see already that it's kind of tricky to construct, right? So if the viewer is the protagonist in the VR experience and is controlling the avatar with their real body, then the viewer is engaged in a first-person narrative experience, right? But if there were a virtual camera mounted behind their avatar or body, as you can see in this experience, then you can see your own back or the top of your own head. And in such an instance, you can be controlling your body in the virtual world while at the same time viewing it as an outside observer. And so in this way, it is possible to have a third-person experience in virtual reality. Again, you just want to think about really what the objective is, right? Because it's a very different feeling being outside of yourself. And then as to what a second-person visual perspective might be, there's still a lot of room for exploration. And I would just say, since visual point of view is about the viewer's relationship to the story, one way to achieve a second-person visual perspective in a fully immersive virtual world is to have the viewer take the visual perspective of a character or game in the story, but not the character they are controlling, right? So I made that allusion to Mario 64 before. Like, if your character in the story is a cameraman and you're seeing the experience through that lens, but you're controlling the character that you're looking at, that would be second person. Have I lost you all? Okay, it seems like you're hanging in there. It's a lot to process. And mostly it's just giving you context, and then you can ask questions and we can have discussion, but it's showing you what's out there. So, okay, so we've covered now visual point of view. So the next one is effectual. Let me just get back. Yeah, so the effectual point of view is addressing what effect the viewer can have on the experience. So we'll just jump in and I'll give you 3 examples, right? So the first kind of effectual point of view is nonentity. The viewer is an invisible observer, and even though you're there, no one can tell. So have any of you done a VR experience like this where you're there, you're seeing everything? Yeah, but you don't really have a role, and if anyone's looking at you, they're sort of looking through you, right? So that's nonentity. And then a great example of that is Felix and Paul's Traveling While Black. This is a sort of a documentary piece, and even though at times you're seated in a restaurant booth with people, you can sort of see that the still shot takes the perspective of the camera. No one ever talks to you or looks at you. It's as if you're not even there, right? Okay, then the next effectual point of view is entity, where the viewer is acknowledged and interacted with, but has no agency. People see you, they may interact with you, but you're not impacting the story. An example of this is Felix and Paul's Mayubi, right? In Mayubi, the viewer is supposed to be like a Japanese robot that was gifted to this little boy for his birthday. And while you're a robot, you can engage with people, right? So when a character turns to you and says, oh, say my name, you, as Mayubi, will say the kid's name, but you, the viewer, aren't controlling if or when you say it, right? So to do that, to have that level of control, you would have to be a participant. So as a participant, the viewer feels like and is somebody who can do things in the space. My favorite example of that is everyone's favorite VR game, Beat Saber. It feels like there's some recognition out there, right? So in Beat Saber, you can do things that are perceived by or affect the scene. Other examples include VR games where the player is moving themselves forward, opening a door, or employing a tool like a paintbrush, a weapon, a laser pointer. Tilt brush is another example, right? Like what you do affects whether you win or lose. And if you paint something in a virtual space, it's there. It has changed the experience. Okay, we're making progress, guys. So with the first three tiers, we've covered narrative, visual, and now effectual point of view. That's most, but not all, of the aspects of a viewer's point of view in an immersive experience. With effectual, we talked about what impact you might have on the scene. With experiential, we're going to talk about what impact you might have on how you experience the scene. So this is a fun example to bring back to Stanford. Experiential, so the first experiential point of view I'm going to talk about is robot, and that means your experience is programmed. You can't control it. You have forced perspective or movement, including when you feel like you're moving forward, but you're not walking or in a vehicle, right? Have any of you done VR experiences like that where you're moving, but you're not moving? Does that make sense? It's as if you were on a moving sidewalk, but there's no moving sidewalk. So one of the things that people talk about as a problem in VR is that in VR, directors don't have control of where the viewer is looking. And so last time I was here at Stanford, actually, I learned about this project that Sean Liu is doing with her Magic grant, which is an experience that it's a software project that is attempting to solve the problem of direction. So actually, it will freeze the VR experience until you look where the director wants you to, and then it will unfreeze it, right? So you don't have a choice. It's making you act like a robot. The next experiential point of view is mortal. An example of this is my show, The Biz Nest, the first immersive sitcom. So I'll give you a quick description of the show, just for context and because it's fun. So it's a workplace comedy that takes place in a co-working space where you're one of the members. So I like to say that instead of watching The Office from the couch in your apartment, it's like watching The Office from the desk next to Jim, right? And so in a mortal experiential point of view, you have anywhere between 0 and 6 degrees of freedom. You don't have to use them all, but you have those options. How many of you are familiar with degrees of freedom? Okay, so I'll just do a quick little aside to address that. So degrees of freedom are how we categorize the functionality of tracking and movement in VR. So the first 3 degrees of freedom, which you'll find in like an Oculus Go. Are you familiar with the Oculus Go headset? So is rolling, right? Moving your head side to side, pitching, which is like nodding up and down, and yawing, which is like this way in a circle. So we've got rolling, pitching, and yawing. And then you can add on 3 more degrees of freedom, which is rotational and translational movement. So elevating, right? Strafing, and surging, right? So VR headsets different headsets allow different degrees of freedom. So one of the first mobile headsets that came out last year. It was the Oculus Go, and what was exciting about that was that it didn't need to be tethered to a computer, and it also didn't require you putting your phone into the headset. And it allowed 3 degrees of freedom. So you could watch stuff, but if you were watching, for example, my show, and you moved forward in real life, you didn't move forward in the world of the show, right? In 6 degrees of freedom, you would have surging. There's a new headset that Oculus put out called the Quest that came out really recently. And in that one, if you do an experience that has 6 degrees of freedom in the Oculus Quest, if you move forward in real life, you also move forward in the game world. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. Then the question arises, 6 degrees of freedom is basically what we have available to us in the real world, right? All those motions that I just did, I can do in this room, and we've managed to match those in the virtual world. Is it possible in VR to have control over more than 6 degrees of freedom, to have more freedom than in real life? And to that I say, yes, it is, right? That's one of the exciting things about virtual reality. So the next experiential point of view I'm going to talk about is Deity. And in this point of view, you can view the world as various people or things, and you can teleport or time travel, things which most of us can't do in real life.
I've always been curious about this. So like if you're in a scene, like how does multiple cameras work? Because you can clearly see them, right? If you're...
Yes. How does multiple cameras work? Let's see, can we circle back to that in the Q&A? Is that all right? Okay. Well, actually, let's see, I'm trying to think. No, you know what, I'll talk about that with the dinner party. That is a well-timed question. So I'll just reorder these. So the dinner party is an experience where it used multiple cameras. So I think what they must have done is either they refilmed it with the camera in different places, or they painted the cameras out, right? So, so in the dinner party, you can actually affect where you're seeing the show from, right? So it's kind of, I think the way to describe it is maybe teleporting around the space. And Jessica Cantor, who created that experience, did it in a game engine. And so actually where you're looking in any given moment determines where you're going to see the next scene from. So if I were looking at you in scene 1 in the red t-shirt, and then for the next scene, scene 2, it might have me come over here because that was where my interest is, right? But if in scene 1 I was looking at you, then in scene 2 I might see it from here. And so in that example, you're not actually changing the story, but you're changing how you experience the story, which is kind of interesting. It's like, whether I'm up here or whether I'm sitting at the tables, if a cell phone rings in this room, I hear it either way, right? But our perspective is a little bit different based on where we are. So that's the example of the dinner party. And to do that, we use multiple cameras. Does that help a little bit? Okay, great. Another example of Deity experiential point of view is an experience called Rome Reborn, which is really cool. So in that one, over on the left, you can experience the Roman ruins as they are today. And you can also experience ancient Rome in its prime just by toggling back and forth, right? So it's sort of time travel. Are you experiencing it then or now? And then U-turn, which is the experience alluded to on the bottom here, you get to choose which body you experience it from. So it's a show where you're working at a nascent tech startup, and you can either experience it as a female coder or like as a male tech bro. And it just depends on where you turn, right? So if you turn this way, you're the female, and that's your arm there with the leather cuff, right? And if you turn the other direction, you're experiencing it as the male. So that's something you could never do in real life, and something that virtual reality Deity experience allows. As a side note, I actually had an experience the other week that reinforced the importance of having this language and raising these questions. I got a call from a VR company in Mexico that needed a storyteller, and they knew they wanted a story. And so I started asking them like what they were looking for, and they said they wanted something interactive. And I was like, okay, but do you want something, interactive where the viewer has an effect on the story, or interactive where they can interact in the space, but it doesn't change the story? And they said, oh, we've never thought about that, right? So, to have the words, to have those conversations is very helpful, and having those words reminds us to have those conversations. Okay, so now we have all the tiers: narrative, visual, effectual, and experiential. What happens when we all put them together? I'm going to go through some examples in a moment. And actually, before I do, I'm reminded of one other thing. So visual is one of our senses, right? And so we have more than one sense. So it begs the question, shouldn't we have perspectives for our other senses, right? For hearing and for feeling. And the answer is yes. So where VR is now, we haven't used all of our other senses to the full extent of their abilities, but the way technology is going, we are going to be able to. So I sort of built this technology so that it could be used going forward. And so while we would, and you'll see in the examples that I give going forward, point out the first-person visual perspective, like there will also be first-person tactile perspective, right? And one of the examples that's really fun is Jackie Mori is a VR researcher and academic in the LA area, and she created a VR scent collar with one of her colleagues. And so you can actually smell in VR, right? So that's a perspective that you can also take into account. So if a VR experience that you're talking about has the sense of smell, then you'd want to add that perspective into our little list that we're about to go through. So the idea of this taxonomy is that it can be expanded to cover everything that we will have going forward. So here we have the experience U-turn that I talked a little bit about. And because you are seeing it in the first person perspective, and also you hear the voice that you're hearing is of you talking, right? The visuals and the narrative match. So it's a first person narrative, first person visual embodied experience. Because the other people in the space see you and acknowledge your presence, but you don't have control over the story or affect what's happening in the story. It's entity. And because you can decide whose body you want to experience it from, which is more than 6 degrees of freedom, it's deity. So the virtual reality point of view for U-turn is first person embodied entity deity perspective, which sounds complicated, but gets easier. And then another example is Henry, an Emmy Award-winning experience from Oculus' Story Studio. And in this experience, if you haven't seen it, Henry is a hedgehog who is sad on his birthday. He has a plate in front of them. Now you feel like you're right there at the table with him, but there's no plate for you, right? You're not really there. You hear, and he doesn't acknowledge or see you. So it's disembodied visuals, right? There's also a voiceover, but you're not the person giving the voiceover. So it's third person narrative. Because no one sees you or acknowledges you, it's non-entity. And because you don't have control over the way you experience it, it's mortal experience. Actually, that might depend on the headset you use to watch it in. So I think if you watch it in an Oculus Go, you can't move around the space. So that would be mortal experiential, and this should actually be updated because if you watch it in the Oculus Rift, you can walk around the space in which it becomes, I'm sorry, so so I think you may have a little bit more control. No, although I think it's still mortal because you can't affect you follow the rules of physics. So I think that's actually correct. Sorry for second guessing myself. I did some updates on this for a book chapter recently, and my mind is all boggled. So anyway, I think you can walk around the space, but you can't affect how you perceive it. So that would be mortal experiential. Okay, piece of cake, right? Wrong image. Yeah, that's what it feels like, right? And you could say that whether we use a clean taxonomy to talk about it or whether we use a 20-minute conversation, like a VR experience is still cool in the same way that this cake still tastes good when it's a mess. And so the question is, like, why even bother to try and neaten it up? I mean, you saw me at some points tripping through my own taxonomy because it's new and we're trying to figure it out. But the thing is, it just makes it easier to talk about, and in a business that we're trying to push forward, right? It's easier to sell a piece of cake that looks like this, right? So the more that we practice this language and develop and promote a common language to have these sorts of conversations, the easier it will be to work together to create really cool boundary-pushing VR experiences, and for journalists to write about it and have the language to talk about it, and for people to tell their friends how cool it is. As a little bit of a tangent, I just want to, on the topic of sales, talk about why, in my work, I chose to do a VR comedy, right? There aren't that many of them. When people hear about it, they generally get excited, which I love. And they also comment to me like, oh, like, I don't know of many people doing comedy in VR, right? And it's not always taken the most seriously, right? Like, you might find other things doing the festival circuit, things that seem really impactful and good. And so that's why I want to just take a moment to talk to you about what I think is the importance of comedy. We've all heard the saying, laughter is the best medicine, right? And comedy actually has really positive impacts. So mirth is the distinctive emotion elicited by the perception of humor. And it causes subjective feelings of pleasure, amusement, and cheerfulness. This emotion is also accompanied by a range of biochemical changes in the brain, autonomic nervous system, and endocrine system, and it affects neurotransmitters, hormones, opioids, neuropeptides, and more, right? So comedy's not just laughable, it's science. This neurochemical cocktail then goes on to have an effect on various parts of the body, including the cardiovascular system, the musculoskeletal system, the digestive system, and the immune systems. And when people are experiencing positive emotions, as opposed to negative or neutral emotions, they show improvements in a variety of social behaviors and cognitive abilities. So they demonstrate greater cognitive flexibility, enabling them to engage in more creative problem solving, more efficient organization and integration of memory, more effective thinking, planning, and judgment, and higher levels of social responsibility and pro-social behaviors such as helpfulness and generosity, right? And then beyond that, inducing mirth by, for example, making someone laugh also helps to reduce the physiological arousal caused by negative emotions. All this to say, in very complicated terms, that comedy is actually good for people. And so then let's combine that with what we know about virtual reality and how that affects people. So how does experiencing comedy in VR compare to experiencing comedy in other media? Well, a 2016 study used neuroscience technology to compare user response to the same content in 3 distinct mediums: in virtual reality, in 360-degree video on a flat surface, and in 2D. Notably, VR experiences received a 17% higher emotional reaction than flat 360-degree video, and a 27% higher reaction than 2D video, right? So that's, if you think TV versus VR, VR has a nearly 30% greater positive impact if you're viewing comedy. Think about that for a second, right? If you go home after work and you're like bummed out or feeling depressed and you turn on a sitcom and you feel better, well, imagine watching it in VR and feeling 30% better than that. Without even taking time to consider the converse, which I think you all should at some point think about, right? What that means for content that might generate negative emotions like fear. Like what's the impact we're having with horror content or first-person shooter games, right? They might sell well, but they're making people 30% more afraid, right? And how do you act in the world when you're acting out of fear? versus how you act in the world when you're acting out of happiness and love and generosity. Like, we carry that with us. We carry our experiences with us. We act on the emotions that we have. So I think if you think about what comedy, the impact that comedy can have on us, it's based on these various scientific studies. I know I didn't list all the authors, but these are all studies, and there'll be a chapter published in a book, Global Immersive Media, coming out next year that will like cite all those studies. It's clear that it's not an overstatement to say that comedy in VR has the potential to make people's lives better. Positive emotions such as mirth are evolved adaptations that contribute to both mental and physical health. And I think this is something worth considering when deciding what to create, what to sell, or what to consume in VR. The experiences stick with you. It's not like just seeing something, right? You have a memory as if you experienced it yourself. One of the examples I always think back on, just in terms of how odd it is sometimes to have a VR experience, is one of the first VR experiences I did was social virtual reality. How many of you are familiar with social virtual reality? Okay, not that many of you, so I'll just give a quick intro to that. So you're all familiar with the concept of a chat room, right? So what if a chat room were an actual virtual room, right? So in social virtual reality, you're going into a virtual space where you can have real-time conversations with other real-life individuals who are represented at this point in time as avatars in the space. So you could be here at Stanford, somebody else could be in London, somebody else could be in New York, but you all feel like you're in the same virtual room. You can walk over to them and you're having like a live conversation. And so the first time I went to a social VR experience, because of where the technology's at, they're currently mostly CGI as opposed to photoreal. So I was effectively existing in a cartoon, right? It was three-dimensional. I could walk around it, I could talk to people, but it was a cartoon world. And so when I left and I was like walking down the street to my car, I was thinking back on it, as we do, right? And an hour from now, I'm gonna be thinking back on this lecture, and I'll be able to like see in my mind your faces, right? And you'll look photoreal. But as I was walking to my car, thinking back on that social virtual reality experience, I had that visual memory, and it was animated. And that's weird, right? Like, I had a real memory from my real life that was animated. So think about that, right? It was very different than if I thought back to watching The Simpsons on TV. It's a totally different experience. So yeah, VR is much more real to us than watching and consuming any other type of media, and that makes it real powerful. But I think it gives those of us who are promoting it, whether by making it, by writing about it, or by selling it, it gives us a real responsibility. So, to sort of start to wrap up, VR is a powerful medium, and it doesn't just allow us to look at the world in a new way, it allows us to look at the world in many new ways. And in order to explore, discuss, recount, critique, develop, and promote virtual reality successfully, we need to be able to communicate clearly about the various points of view that VR gives us. And not just VR, XR, right? That includes augmented reality and virtual reality and mixed reality and all the realities. So hopefully this taxonomy is a helpful jumping off point to get you to think about it and talk about it. And I'll be very happy to answer your questions. You know, I am here today as an embodied first-person narrative, first-person visual, effectual, you know, participant, mortal. So, you know, let's talk.
Great. That was so helpful.
Yeah?
Yeah, I have not processed VR that way. And I think that the idea of giving vocabulary will enable the business folks to have reasons to be doing this, because one of the questions that we have here is going to be Jacob, Divine, Karen, and Sweet Cat are going to kick off the conversations, but one of them is like, will this ever take off? Will it monetize? So who was that? It was, anyway, I'll let you guys answer.
The greatest hits of VR questions.
But this explains to me, in a way that I haven't heard before, where this might go and how it would make sense and this kind of sense too.
Yeah, oh good. I'm really glad to hear that.
Okay, so you guys want to go? Who wants to go first? Kick it off.
I can go first. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I should say, before that, I was really a VR pessimist.
Oh.
But I'm beginning to have some hope. But nonetheless, my question is, given the fact that BBC and Google have abandoned their VR ventures, what, in your opinion, do you think is the future of VR in terms of commercial viability?
I believe in it. I think that people are struggling to figure out how to use it. I think, and everyone's coming around to it in their own time. So right now I feel like we're seeing like more use of VR in medical fields or in like enterprise and training situations, right? Because people know how to use that. Like they've already found that it's more effective in those situations. There are things that you can do, I'm trying to think of examples, because like I know in like the world of health, I think they're using it. They've created VR apps that can like help the elderly with their balance. And there are mind games that are, well, not mind games in the crazy way, but like, you know, mental exercises that you can do in VR that are different than ones that you would do in the real world. And because they're in VR, they can help people avoid Alzheimer's and like strengthen their brain. So there are also like physical therapy experiences for people who've lost limbs, where you know you can sort of move your virtual limb where your arm would have been, and doing that like can help relieve pain. There are also studies that have been done where with people who are like burn victims, and they find that if they put you in like an icy virtual environment, you feel 40% less pain than you would if you were just having your bandage changed without a VR headset, and that's without pain medication, right? So 40% less pain with no medication is like kind of amazing. So those are the sorts of things that like people understand the applications of VR in those areas now, and they're moving those forward. I know they've also used it for training purposes. I think it was Johnson & Johnson recently put out a press release about using it for surgical training, and they found that like the surgeons just learned better. Like they could be trusted to operate on real people sooner if they were trained in VR. Walmart is using it for customer service training. So it's really clear in those sorts of situations that VR is useful and has like a greater return on investment than non-VR, situations. I think entertainment is coming to it a little slower. They're trying to figure out how to get people to adopt it. And I think there are a couple of challenges. I mean, I hear still from storytellers in Hollywood that like, oh, no one knows how to tell stories in VR. I do. I told one, and people really enjoy it. Now, has it reached everyone yet? No. And are there different kinds of stories to tell? Absolutely. There are so many ways to tell a story. But I'm really proud that the business is a new kind of storytelling. And I actually had the opportunity to show it recently to John Truby. I don't know if any of you are storytelling aficionados, but he wrote The Anatomy of Story. And his reaction was just fantastic. He can sort of see where this is going. And so I think it's twofold, right? Like, I think Hollywood thinks, okay, if we can take existing IP that people are familiar with, that will be the gateway that pulls them in. They're like, I want to see these characters I already love in a new environment, and there's some truth to that. I also think there's a barrier to entry, right? I mean, some people, on the one hand, some of the headsets can be costly, they can be cumbersome, they're still working out bugs, they don't work perfectly all the time, they're not easy, they're getting there, they're improving, they're vastly, but there are times when I send something to a friend who's a VR professional and it's kind of a headache for them to watch it, right? So we've got to get over that, and also marketing. I'm not sure how familiar you are in this room with the Google Cardboard. Have any of you heard of Google Cardboard? Okay, so most of you are. The world at large is not, right? So you people in the VR industry think 360 video is dead and over, but America doesn't really know it even existed. You know, there's so many people I meet on a regular basis when I tell them that, oh, you can take a 360 video and scroll on your computer and see things all the way around the room. They're like, what? No. You know, and then I say, oh, and for $5 to $10, you can buy a plastic viewer or a cardboard and put your phone in it and have an immersive experience. They don't even know that's possible. And for people who've never done VR, when they have that experience, like their mind is blown, right? So it just takes a while. I like to think back to the cell phones, right? Like in the 80s, there were car phones, which were these giant bricks. And you're like, who needs to talk on the phone in their car? Like, like why would you spend money on that? And also it's giant and it has to be plugged in with a cord. And like, what are people, like just use your phone at home, right? And now here we are and we all have a phone in our pocket and it's easy and we can't live without it. So right now the VR headsets are these giant bricks that are difficult to use, but technology is evolving faster than it ever has before. So where will we be in 10 years? Does that answer your question and many more questions? You didn't.
I think that also answers my question. So can I go off script?
Sure, of course.
So I'm coming from a background where I talk to a lot of VR software developers, and one thing that comes up like right off the bat, because it really constrains what they can do, is like motion sickness or nausea, because it's still a big problem. It's a bigger problem for women compared to men. And like, have you thought about, like, because I think the taxonomy is really cool. Have you thought about how nausea or motion sickness might fit in? Like, are there kinds of experiences that you can stick to if you want to have no risk of that, or ones that you know are more risky? Like to have like a first person versus a third person view?
That's a really good question. I think that would be really interesting to test similar experiences from first and third person, that ones that have motion, and see how it affects you. I mean, I find in general that like if you're in an experience, and I talked about this a little bit when I was talking about robot perspective, right? That I said that's where you're moving but you don't have control of it, like, and you're not in a vehicle, right? So that makes a huge difference. So if I'm in an experience and I'm robot POV and I'm moving forward and I'm not in a vehicle, I find that disturbing and it makes me a little bit sick. If you put me in a virtual car and I'm moving forward, it doesn't bother me as much. And then I did an experience last week at Universal Studios in LA. They have this The Bride of Frankenstein VR experience out in time for Halloween, and they actually put you in a Ford. So I got in a car and I put on a VR headset, and this driver took me on the 101. And so as I was moving in the real car, I was also moving in a virtual car. I didn't experience any level of motion sickness. The engineers did a really good job of matching it, which is part of it. You know, part of it is matching, getting the speeds right. Another part of it is making sure that it's a really good, high-quality visual experience. If it's out of focus, that can cause nausea. And then I think, you know, making it feel sort of natural and okay with us. You know, it's weird to be moving when you're not moving. And you can get away with it, but I don't feel like it's ever that great of an experience. So, like it's always a little unnerving and uncomfortable to me. So those are my thoughts on it.
Karen?
Yeah, so you were talking about kind of the places where applicability is taking off, and in helping understand kind of what the future might look like. Can you talk more about sort of the cost of the creation of the content and the complexity and difficulty of creating quality content?
That is a big, broad question. I think it depends what kind of content you want to create. It can be expensive. It can also not be that expensive. You know, when I was first looking at creating the sitcom, I was getting these like really big numbers, right? Because anyone who wants to be, it's hard work and it's a new field, and creators do need to be compensated. At the same time, a lot of the technology is coming down in cost. So, you know, you can get a consumer 360 camera for a couple $100s. And, you know, it depends what you need to do with it, right? So if you want to just capture something and edit it in Premiere, it's relatively simple. I don't want to say anything. It depends on what skill sets you have. But that's not that expensive. You know, if you want to create an entire virtual world, that people can interact with in real time and have social experiences in, that's harder and more expensive. So I think it's a range. I mean, your question was sort of just where is it going and how expensive is it? I mean, it so depends. And I imagine it's a marketplace. Like, I'd be curious to get the thoughts of some of you folks who are doing your MBA, right? Because there's a supply and demand element to it. Like, where are you finding the programmers, and yeah. So I would say, like, I think my answer is it varies widely, but I think don't be afraid. Like, if you're interested in creating something, I don't think it necessarily has to be prohibitively expensive. And it depends on how you choose to do it also, right? Like, there are ways that you can create it that are more cost effective, and the ways you can plan for something that's more cost effective. I feel like that's not the most helpful answer. Is that somewhat helpful?
Yeah, I was just trying to overlay that into the notion of how sort of traditional forms of journalism might incorporate VR. And so that comes back to the immediacy of how quickly can I get something done, how much is it going to cost, is it long form, is it short form?
Well, I had a great conversation with somebody who he just took over a big news organization to do 360 VR, and I'm blanking on which one. But I really appreciated his attitude, because he's been working in XR for a while, and and I think people in VR can be very excited and stuck on the tech, and they want to show off all the fancy bells and whistles, but I think there's something about just creating more content, and it sounds like you, from a journalism background, appreciate that, like, journalism is about the story of the day, just getting stuff out there. And so I found his attitude refreshing, of he just wants to create content and push it out there, and you can do that in journalism, because the story, like, you can't afford to take 2 weeks to tell today's story. It's going to be out of date, and people, as a result, accept a slightly lower quality bar. Not to say it's low quality, but you don't necessarily need fancy visual effects or spatial audio. You might just want to take that consumer 360 camera, pop it up, capture a moment, and push it out. Also, I've been having conversations with people about, like, how else can you tell news stories in journalism, and whether it's like overlaying things on the actual world, or using visual diagrams so that we can experience data in a way that affects us more. Somebody had a great idea the other day. This isn't quite journalism, but it was like a shopping thing where basically it shows you your impact. It shows you, like, the impact that something would have on the world. Like, it can give you a different perspective, right? So if you look at something, here's, I don't know, an example, maybe it related to climate change. Like, if I look at that tree, I could have a VR and AR overlay that tells me how much carbon dioxide is pulling out of the atmosphere, right? Or like just things like that. Like, it can give us a new perspective on the world. So I think there's the quick turnover of, like, live action content, and I think there's also using the tools that VR gives us that other media doesn't.
Just on that point, with the night yesterday, we made two use documentaries in VR, Congo and the Nile. And the value of it was essentially to give people something they couldn't possibly get watching it on telly or on the radio. Just, way to answer your question a bit, we did it spatially. We properly designed it and made it a really kick-ass thing to experience, and built the stories for all the other gathering, TV, radio, and text, around experiences in VR. But the big problem is how people actually see it. What we've done is we've taken the goes, because they're cheap, taken them around libraries in Britain, and then suddenly exposed hundreds of people to something that they can't get much access to. The impact we talk about is huge, and that gets us to ask, well, although not many people are seeing it, the impact of the people who are seeing it is very significant, and therefore if you're going to use a metric for how successful a product is, it's actually been very successful in that sense. Yes, they have just shut it down, but I'm going back in a year, we're going to get it going again.
Good. I'm excited to hear that, yes.
In the same vein. So the New York Times sent out the cardboard glasses, and did a lot of VR for a little while. Do you know how that experience, what was the uptake like? Anybody watching?
Gosh, I mean, I don't have the data on that. I know from anecdotal experience, like I've talked to people and I was like, oh, have you heard of a Google Cardboard? And they're like, oh yeah, I think I got one with my newspaper a while ago, So it did raise some awareness. I think that the New York Times did pump out a significant amount of content for a while, both sort of news related and narrative. And so that was just, I'm sorry?
Money run out.
Yeah.
Google
Yeah.
giving them money to do it. That's why.
Eve, can I ask a
Yeah.
question related to overhead? First of all, I've seen the business. I recommend you all check it out. It's hilarious. But also, the thing you notice is that it's like many sitcoms happening at once. In the sense, I've watched it multiple times, and if I'm looking at this perspective, I get to see some action happening, but there's stuff happening behind me. And so, as a creator, how much more effort goes into writing, directing something that's happening in 360 versus, a traditional sitcom?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And thanks for being a fan. So I actually like to think of it as like when I was directing a scene, it was kind of like I was directing 5 scenes at once, right? Because my goal was to have something happening in sort of every section at the same time, but not to the point where it was distracting. I've been to some immersive theater productions where I feel like, oh, if you go this way, you're convinced you're missing out on something in another room, and I didn't want that FOMO feeling. But in the real world, something's happening in every direction all the time, right? I mean, for those of you who are sitting in the middle of the room, if you look behind you, like life hasn't stopped. Someone's playing with her earring or typing on a keyboard. Like there's something happening there. So I was trying to keep that reality alive. And so in that sense, yeah, it was a little bit like directing 5 scenes, or pick a number for every one scene. And so I would think about like, okay, when I'm facing this, there's sort of 2 ways to think about it, right? It's like when you're facing this way, what's happening in front of the camera here, and then what's happening over here. And then it's also directing storylines. So I would kind of start by directing a storyline and figure out how that storyline moved through the space. It was a little bit of choreography, sort of like think of it like theater in the round, sort of. And then once I had like the main storyline laid out and I knew where that tracked, then I would think about, okay, what spaces are left where we haven't had action, and how can I take those other storylines and thread them through. So sitcoms on television, there are 2 kinds. There's multi-camera and single camera. And so multi-camera sitcoms, they're telling multiple stories, but the way you travel between the stories is by cutting, right? You'll be with Will and Grace, and then you'll cut, and you'll be with Jack and Karen. Or you'll be with Ross and Rachel, and then you'll cut, and you'll be with Chandler and Monica. Sometimes those storylines pass through the same scene, right? You'll deal with one story and then the next. And so I took that concept of multi-camera, and I was like, okay, well, in a 360 space, you've got one camera that's capturing everything. So let's take out the multi from the camera and add it to the storyline. So it's multi-storyline. So you have multiple storylines passing through the space, sort of sequentially, one right after another, if that makes sense. Yeah, and so directing them and then like layering them on top of each other and making sure that they fill the space but don't step on each other. Is that helpful? Okay.
I think that's a wrap.
A wrap, okay. Thank you guys.